Welcome to one and all. You're very welcome to today's Ask the Author session on decarbonising air transport with Pierpaolo Cazzola, who is our advisor on energy, technology and environmental sustainability at the International Transport Forum. A quick reminder that the Ask the Author sessions we do following each of our report launches. It's a very quick fire 30-minute session. Pierpaolo will give you an overview of the findings and insights from the report in a quick presentation, and then we'll have the floor open for your questions. So don't hesitate to put your questions already in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and that will allow us to get to as many questions as we can. So without further ado, I will hand over to Pierpaolo for the presentation. Pierpaolo. You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Ronan. And hi, everyone. I'm going to walk you through the work we did for this report. It's a pleasure to be here. First slide we have is about where we stand with emissions from aviation. So aviation is one of the more energy and CO2 intensive transport modes. It accounted for roughly a gigaton of CO2 direct emissions in 2019, plus non-CO2 and indirect emissions, for example, related with the need to produce the fuels, which add to that in terms of impact, significantly in the case of non-CO2 climate impacts. Then aviation is characterized by very long distance travel links, and that is a factor that expands its carbon footprint. And it's also seen as a sector that, despite the big hit that received with the COVID-19, is bound to resume activity significantly in the future, even though the projections we have available in the post-COVID reality show lower rates of growth than what we were seeing before. Aviation is also a sector characterized by limited opportunities for abatement of emissions, or opportunities that come at relatively high abatement costs, and this is also combined with the prospects for growth, something that struggles to align with the need to meet the ambition of the Paris Agreement and keep the planet, the temperature on the planet, the temperature increase below 1.5 degrees over the course of the next decades. A number of actions have been undertaken by the International Civil Aviation to try to respond to this challenge. Here we listed some of the most relevant ones. The aspirational goal of achieving average fuel efficiency improvement of 2% per year, and then also the idea of carbon neutral growth beyond 2020. And so to achieve this, ICAO has been pushing forward a number of measures, a series of measures, some of which look at aircraft technology and operation and increasing the energy efficiency and reducing carbon intensity. And then others that are more focused on reducing the carbon intensity of the fuels, in particular with the introduction of sustainable aviation fuels. Finally, there's all this is also complemented by a global market-based measure, which is CORSIA, which is aiming to, well, it's bringing together the aspect of reducing carbon intensity of the fuels along with the possibility to use offsets to achieve the carbon neutral growth. In any case, it's clear that even accounting for the two aspirational goals mentioned earlier, there's a risk to fall short of the Paris Agreement, and this is one of the reasons why ICAO is now seeking a longer-term aspirational goal that is linked with that. In addition to what has been done at ICAO, there have been a number of developments that took place at the national level. They relate with fuel and carbon taxation. The inclusion of aviation in emission trading schemes, especially relevant in Europe, the use of ticket taxes, but also the introduction of, or proposals for introduction of low carbon fuel standards and blending mandates at the national level. And then on the industry side, there are also objectives that are ambitious. In particular, there's an additional objective compared to what I just mentioned for ICAO, which is halving emissions relative to 2005 by 2050, with a 4-pillar strategy that is similar to what ICAO outlined, based on operational improvements, energy efficiency improvement in aircraft technology, sustainable aviation fuels, and carbon offsetting. On screen, you see the cover of a report that was recently released by ATAG, which is the association, let's say, representing aviation industry stakeholders, on decarbonization related with so pathways to outlining pathways to actually meet the ambition of this 4-pillar strategy, of this goal of halving emission in 2050 compared to 2005. So what we did on our side is to also look at like starting from here and looking at technology options and policy options. We try to outline what we see as a feasible way forward to promote the decarbonization of aviation. So I'll focus here on some of the aspects of the current report, not the whole report due to time. These include the need to reduce energy needed for flying, so measure related with efficiency, but energy efficiency, incremental measures like reducing weight, improving aerodynamics, but also measures related with shifting fuels, and so changing propulsion system in order to enable access to different fuels, for example, electric, the use of hybrid or electric propulsion systems, and then also instruments that allow to switch to low carbon fuels and other energy vectors. And for these, we identified the relevance of ensuring that we have, this happens through processes that are focused on solutions that have strict sustainability requirements and can be produced at scale. So for that, we identified sustainable aviation fuels, electricity, hydrogen, and to some extent, low carbon aviation fuels, which are fossil-based fuels with lower carbon content as possible parts of the solution. I'll zoom now on the case of sustainable aviation fuels, which are really a focus of a lot of attention recently. So we understand there are different families of production of SAF, oleochemical, biochemical, and thermochemical, with different characteristics, but all that had approved pathways for the use of alternative fuels, alternative low carbon sustainable fuels in aviation. In addition to this, there's been a lot of debate about the concept of electrofuel or power to liquids, which share with some of the pathways approved the final stage, the synthesis, the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis of carbon monoxide and hydrogen to actually then produce aviation fuel. So this is something that is, let's say, can be integrated in the approved processes by basically making that link. But this is something in development right now and not yet finalized. One of the key barriers of these fuels, any of them, is the fact that the production cost comes at higher levels compared with petroleum-based fuels. And so they struggle to come in the mix without a supportive policy framework. Here you have examples of ranges of costs we assessed for oleochemical, thermochemical, SAF, and then e-fuels, compared with fossil jet kerosene on the left. So that the slide shows clearly that there is a cost increase to face. So what could be the best solutions to actually help moving forward in decarbonizing, in particular the fuel side? We understand that in the near term, what is the best fit, you'll find a lot more in the report, are oleochemical pathways based on waste oils. That beyond these, there are possibilities to use low carbon hydrogen in refining. So, and then beyond that, the integration of biogenic feedstocks in refining processes that can help reducing carbon content on a life cycle basis of the fuel, and in general, and then therefore also of aviation as a whole. Then the possibility to combine fuels that have carbon from biogenic origin and renewable hydrogen, which is something that has a lower technology readiness, but has a high potential because it would allow maximizing the use of biogenic carbon. And then I mentioned earlier electrofuels, which face the challenge of requiring a rollout of a very large scale rollout of very low carbon electricity with very low costs of production. So something that is possible, but not necessarily everywhere in the world, and really the areas with the highest potential. What else? So other solutions we looked into was the combination of negative emissions from biomass, carbon removal storage, and fossil fuel extraction. One could compensate the other, but this requires the viability of carbon capture and storage at scale and a strong policy framework enabling allowing this to happen in a way that is actually not leading to emission increases. And also something that faces, to the extent to which the biomass, the carbon is from biogenic origin, faces the same challenges related with sustainably produced biomass. Other alternatives include DAC, which is direct air capture, combined with geological storage, which could be an alternative to actually compensate for emissions that would still be resulting from fossil fuel combustion. So this is again something that faces significant challenges in terms of because it requires a lot of energy. You need to reverse the combustion process, and that energy needs to be very low carbon and also available at very low cost in order to make that an option that could work. So there again, there are scale and energy demand challenges, but and also this is something that requires clearly a framework that enables raising revenues for that. So a carbon price, but it's something that, if not well applied, may actually lead also to risks of overdoing like expanding the need for storage, and that is definitely a challenge given the size limitation, the scale limitation that exists in terms of rolling out renewable energy to be able to achieve that. So given all these, we also feel that there is a strong need for increased efficiency, energy efficiency, material efficiency across the board, and in particular, energy efficiency of flight. And we expect this to become an increasing priority, higher than what has been discussed so far, and something also that is important to ensure that to compensate, let's say, the negative implication of switching to fuels which are more expensive to produce. So we then in the report you'll find our suggestions for policy pathways to decarbonize our transport, and there you'll see we start from the idea of a cross-sectoral and global carbon price, which acknowledging that this has been a challenge to achieve. We go into as a second best option, which is an aviation-specific global carbon price, which is also something that, well, this is the road taken in ICAO and also facing challenges in terms of implementation. Then we look into options related with regional carbon pricing. We analyze EU ETS, for example, but also look at cases where you can apply taxation. So, and suggesting that that can be a way forward if the earlier measures are unachievable. And then we also go quite deep into the aspect of technology policies, which are important to bring down costs. And I'll then have a slide on technology policies to give you a little bit more detail about this. So we looked more specifically at we suggest that there are instruments like regulations on aircraft fuel efficiency that can be tightened, or that can be, well, there is already a framework, and it can be the transition towards the most efficient aircrafts can be accelerated, especially in leading markets. We talk quite extensively about low carbon fuel standards and blending mandates and which kind of form. So different forms of blending mandates also include compliance penalties and can be combined with carbon pricing to actually create an enabling environment for investors to move towards to scale up sustainable aviation fuel production. We looked at some forms of ticket taxes that can also be fit for purpose, especially if they are linked with specifically with environmental performance of flights and fuels, essentially by basically stimulating a greater adoption. And then we also consider financial instruments that have a general capacity to lower capital costs and reduce the risk of investments in these low carbon fuel technologies. And so there's a long list of different instruments here. We also give examples of cases that have already been successful in lifting up plants that produce sustainable aviation fuels. Final point is research, so more long-term investments in terms of really trying to push forward the agenda on the development of breakthrough technologies, and this is something that is more related with research funding and innovation funding rather than the instruments mentioned above. So, in conclusion, what we recommend is that there's a need to integrate clear decarbonization requirement into government support packages following the issues raised by the COVID crisis. So it's important to link what is happening in terms of future investment or response to COVID to things that will effectively decarbonize aviation. We include a recommendation on the need to establish a long-term vision for decarbonizing air transport and using, setting and monitoring emission reduction targets in line with the Paris Agreement. So that's essentially the direction that ICAO should take, and bearing in mind the importance of the alignment. And then we have a recommendation about the need to support an international approach to the mitigation of climate change in aviation, due to the peculiarities of the sector and the importance to have a level playing field across the board. But then also we're open to the idea of implementing decarbonization policies at the domestic and regional level, in particular when it comes to aspects related with carbon pricing and low carbon fuel policies, so like such as LCFS or blending mandates, or blending mandate combined with other instruments enabling this technology, this surge in investment in SAF, for example, in low carbon fuels, and also in then demand for those. We also have a recommendation to ensure that this transition to low carbon fuel is actually certified as sustainable for all new pathways that are not yet covered in this framework. So there's a lot of work to do there. And then we recommend to strengthen the effectiveness of regulatory frameworks on energy efficiency. I mentioned earlier the importance of the complementarity between energy efficiency and low carbon fuels. And then we have a recommendation related with research encouragement and this mission-oriented type of development, so research funding. And finally, we flag the relevance of tackling not only CO2 emission, but also aspects related with non-CO2 climate impacts, given that they inflate a lot the climate forcing effects of aviation with respect to just looking at the CO2. So that's also a very important point. Well, I hope I wasn't too rushy, and I did find a lot more in the report also on things I did not cover, like operational improvements, evolutions of load factors, and yeah, more detail of what I could cover. And so I encourage you to have a look, and I'm here available if you have any questions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Pierpaolo, for that very rapid but very concentrated summary of the findings from this report. So again, we're going to open the floor now to our question and answer session. It's a reminder to you, pop your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And a reminder that this work, like all of our decarbonization work, is part of our Decarbonising Transport initiative. If you're not aware of the initiative, there's a link in the chat now. You can go and look at our latest reports and findings that are within that. So the questions are coming in. So the first question from Emilia Suolanien from the Finnish Environmental Agency, which picks up on looking at not just efficiency or sustainable fuels, but the demand side. And I guess, Pierpaolo, this links into the question of flight shaming and the whole question of should we be considering other options on the demand side, for example, high-speed rail as alternatives to aviation. Has your work looked into this aspect?
Yeah, so I saw that Emilia also mentioned that some of the things I talked about answer the question. So there's a case, for example, for ticket taxes and carbon pricing, because they do have an impact on demand. So basically by altering the cost. I think also shift to SAF to the extent to which they lead to higher costs of the fuels, end up having an impact on demand unless they are compensated by energy efficiency improvements. And in addition to these, as you said, Ronan, we also looked at this. Well, there are references to work that's been done in the past on the scope for shifting part of the activity from flights from aviation to rail. What I can say on that is that I think it's very important to ensure that, well, I think the scope of this is limited by the need to move lots of people from A to B in the case of rail transport in order to justify economically. So you need basically a line, a high-speed line that is well connected with airports and also that has a high capacity of transporting people, high potential, high demand. So it can replace aviation on corridors where there's high demand. Also because there's a need to build the rail line. So if it doesn't already exist, and that also is associated with emissions. So there's a need to balance what can be achieved with that sort of shift and what can be achieved differently in terms of supporting aircraft to become more energy efficient and reducing the carbon intensity of the fuels. So there is scope, but within limits, let's say. And so, yeah, you'll find material about that in the report. But as I said, our understanding is that the scope for that is limited by the characteristics of what can work economically as an alternative in the case of rail.
Okay, fair enough. I'll just take this opportunity as well to let you know about the Transport Climate Action Directory, which is part of the Decarbonising Transport Initiative. So this is our catalogue of measures that will help support countries in developing their greenhouse gas mitigation strategies, particularly at this moment where NDCs are being reconsidered and revised in the run-up to COP26. There's a link also in the chat that brings you to that tool, which is an online database. It's just been strengthened with a few more measures, some of which include aviation. So within that tool, you can filter easily by mode, in this case, aviation, and you'll find the new measures that we published online very recently. So keep your questions coming in on the Q&A. We still have a little bit more time. A question on carbon capture. Pierpaolo, you mentioned that solutions are based on the concept of capturing and storing atmospheric carbon, either to produce fuels or to offset emissions. So what are the limitations in scope of those approaches of carbon capture?
Yeah, a point that I think is important to flag when it comes to carbon capture is that carbon capture is not the panacea. It's not something that it's easy to adopt to essentially offset volumes of emissions we already have and we will have or risk to have of having in the future, because it's a very well, to the extent to which it comes from things like direct air capture, it really requires significant amounts of energy. And energy needs to be coming from very low carbon sources. And so that means that you need a rollout, which is very significant in scale of low carbon electricity sources and the use of heat pumps to extract ambient heat that you can then use for the purpose of capturing carbon and from the atmosphere. And so that means that it's a very it's something that risks of like putting a lot of pressure on the need to scale up renewables and also taking away opportunities for those renewable energy for renewable energy to actually be used to substitute existing demand of fossil energy. So I think it's something that needs to be used for cases where there are very little alternatives to decarbonize. And so thinking about that as a key solution for aviation is something that I think well, I don't personally think it's something that it's a very safe bet for succeeding in the decarbonization of air transport. So I see it as something that will be relevant to really get down to zero when we have done everything we can to reduce emissions in the first place.
Okay, so it's a longer term solution in that case. Amelia, I think, has a question linked to that point. She asks, do you believe that national and regional, for example, European actions are also relevant here? And should we not wait for international agreements? I'm assuming that's on the carbon capture question still, Amelia.
Well, what I can say is that, as I said, at the beginning, well, in general, there is a relevance to try to take global action. It's ideal, but one needs to face the fact that it's not easy to find necessarily global consensus. And so I think, given the urgency of taking action on climate, I think it's legitimate to think that different regions will start taking measures to move forward. And so that's the logic that we explain on why we think there is scope for taking regional action. And of course, examples of what is happening in Europe are part of that, given that Europe is at the moment one of the global regions where there's a lot going on in trying to shape what's going to be a decarbonized continent. So, well, I do think that the urgency of climate action is something that justifies regional actions, but ideally the solutions would be better if they can be worked out at the global scale. I hope this answers.
Okay, thanks very much. If you've got any last questions, pop them into the Q&A function. If you don't mind just answering a quick online poll, it's 2 quick multi-choice questions to help us to work out, is this useful? Are these Ask the Authors useful for you? Another question on the broader scope of this type of work, Pierpaolo, and to see if there are lessons that can be drawn from this work on aviation that will have implications for other transport modes. And I'm picking up a question from an OECD colleague, Clark Daniel, who's asking, will there be other studies on different transport modes? He mentions maritime shipping. Perhaps there are others.
Yeah, I think that there are lots of things that we wrote in this report that also have relevance, especially all the part on the fuels for maritime transport. Maritime is also a sector where direct electrification is a challenge, especially for long distance transport. And so you really need to do something about low carbon fuels. They're not necessarily the same as those you can use for air transport. There's more scope for using green methanol or ammonia, for example. And but a lot, I mean, a lot of the background is the same. And also what we wrote about potential of complementarity between offsetting and fossil fuel extraction is something that links to that. The challenges we flagged for e-fuels, for DAC, are relevant for both. We released a report that has a focus on maritime. It's called Navigating Towards Cleaner Maritime Transport, with a focus on what is happening in the Nordics, but that has very much relevance globally, given the leadership that the Nordic region is showing there. So we released this in December 2020, and I think this is very much still relevant. You'll find a lot of what I just mentioned in there, and yeah, taken with this one, which goes a little further on the challenges of offsetting, I think is a great resource for people interested in shipping decarbonization.
That's great. So I put the links to that report, Pierpaolo, as well as our earlier report on decarbonising maritime transport to 2035, also in the chat link. Again, all of this work is part of the Decarbonising Transport Initiative. The first link in the chat will guide you to this and work that we've done for similar modes. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. Pierpaolo, we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for your questions. There's a quick link if you'd like to subscribe to ITF newsletters and alerts. We do a specific newsletter for decarbonising transport that comes out quarterly, which you're very welcome to sign up to, as well as our regular newsletter and publication alerts. So thank you all very much for being part of this. Thank you very much, Pierpaolo, for a very clear presentation. If you have any additional questions, just reach out to us via the contact form on the ITF website, and we'll be very happy to take additional questions. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.